Chapter 3 of Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lisa Reichert. Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic by Benedetto Croce, translated by Douglas Ainslie, 1865 to 1948. Chapter 3 Art and Philosophy. Indissolubility of intellective from intuitive knowledge. The two forms of knowledge, aesthetic and intellectual or conceptual, are indeed diverse, but this does not amount altogether to separation and disjunction, as we find with two forces going each its own way. If we have shown that the aesthetic form is altogether independent of the intellectual, and suffices to itself without external support, we have not said that the intellectual can stand without the aesthetic. This reciprocity would not be true. What is knowledge by concepts? It is knowledge of relations of things, and those things are intuitions. Concepts are not possible without intuitions, just as intuition is itself impossible without the material of impressions. Intuitions are this river, this lake, this brook, this rain, this glass of water. The concept is water. Not this or that appearance and particular example of water, but water in general, in whatever time or place it be realized, the material of infinite intuitions, but of one single and constant concept. However, the concept, the universal, if it be no longer intuition in one respect, is in another respect intuition, and cannot fail of being intuition. For the man who thinks has impressions and emotions, in so far as he thinks. His impression and emotion will not be love or hate, but the effort of his thought itself, with the pain and the joy, the love and the hate joined to it. This effort cannot but become intuitive in form, in becoming objective to the mind. To speak is not to think logically, but to think logically is at the same time to speak. Critique of the negations of this thesis. That thought cannot exist without speech is a truth generally admitted. The negations of this thesis are all founded on equivoques and errors. The first of the equivoques is implied by those who observe that one can likewise think with geometrical figures, algebraical numbers, ideographic signs, without a single word, even pronounced silently and almost insensibly within one. They also affirm that there are languages in which the word, the phonetic sign, expresses nothing, unless the written sign also be looked at. But when we said speech, we intended to employ a synecdoche, and that expression generically should be understood. For expression is not only so-called verbal expression, as we have already noted. It may be admitted that certain concepts may be thought without phonetic manifestations, but the very examples adduced to show this also prove that those concepts never exist without expressions. Others maintain that animals, or certain animals, think or reason without speaking. Now, as to how, whether, and what animals think, whether they be rudimentary, half-savage men resisting civilization, rather than physiological machines, as the old spiritualists would have it, are questions that do not concern us here. When the philosopher talks of animal, brutal, impulsive, instinctive nature, and the like, he does not base himself on conjectures as to these facts concerning dogs or cats, lions or ants, but upon observations of what is called animal and brutal in man, of the boundary or animal basis of what we feel in ourselves. If individual animals, dogs or cats, lions or ants, possess something of the activity of man, so much the better, or so much the worse for them. This means that as regards them also we must talk, not of their nature as a whole, but of its animal basis, as being perhaps larger and more strong than the animal basis of man. And if we suppose that animals think and form concepts, what is there in the line of conjecture to justify the admission that they do so without corresponding expressions? The analogy with man, the knowledge of the spirit, human psychology, which is the instrument of all our conjectures as to animal psychology, would oblige us to suppose that if they think in any way, they also have some sort of speech. It is from human psychology, that is, literary psychology, that comes the other objection, to the effect that the concept can exist without the word, because it is true that we all know books that are well thought and badly written. That is to say, a thought which remains thought beyond the expression, notwithstanding the imperfect expression. But when we talk of books well thought and badly written, we cannot mean other than that in those books are parts, pages, periods, or propositions well thought out and well written, and other parts, perhaps the least important, ill thought out and badly written, not truly thought out, and therefore not truly expressed. Where Vico's Scienza Nuova is really ill written, it is also ill thought out. If we pass from the consideration of big books to a short proposition, the error or the imprecision of this statement will be recognized at once. How could a proposition be clearly thought and confusedly written out? All that can be admitted is that sometimes we possess thoughts, concepts, in an intuitive form, or in an abbreviated, or, better, peculiar expression, sufficient for us, but not sufficient to communicate it with ease to another or other definite individuals. Hence people say inaccurately that we have the thought without the expression, whereas it should properly be said that we have indeed the expression, but in a form that is not easy of social communication. This, however, is a very variable and altogether relative fact. There are always people who catch our thought on the wing, and prefer it in its abbreviated form, and would be displeased with the greater development of it, necessary for other people. In other words, the thought considered abstractly and logically will be the same, but aesthetically we are dealing with two different intuition expressions, into both of which enter different psychological elements. The same argument suffices to destroy, that is, to interpret correctly, the altogether empirical distinction between an internal and an external language. Art and science. The most lofty manifestations, the summits of intellectual and of intuitive knowledge shining from afar, are called, as we know, art and science. Art and science, then, are different and yet linked together. They meet on one side, which is the aesthetic side. Every scientific work is also a work of art. The aesthetic side may remain little noticed, when our mind is altogether taken up with the effort to understand the thought of the man of science, and to examine its truth. But it is no longer concealed when we pass from the activity of understanding to that of contemplation, and behold that thought either developed before us, limpid, exact, well-shaped, without superfluous words, without lack of words, with appropriate rhythm and intonation, or confused, broken, embarrassed, tentative. Great thinkers are sometimes termed great writers, while other equally great thinkers remain more or less fragmentary writers, if indeed their fragments are scientifically to be compared with harmonious, coherent, and perfect works. Content and form. Another meaning. Prose and poetry. We pardon thinkers and men of science their literary mediocrity. The fragments console us for the failure of the whole, for it is far more easy to recover the well-arranged composition from the fragmentary work of genius than to achieve the discovery of genius. But how can we pardon mediocre expression in pure artists? Mediocribus esse poetis non homines non concessere columnae. The poet or painter who lacks form lacks everything, because he lacks himself. Poetical material permeates the soul of all. The expression alone, that is to say, the form, makes the poet. And here appears the truth of the thesis which denies to art all content, as content being understood just the intellectual concept. In this sense, when we take content as equal to concept, it is most true, not only that art does not consist of content, but also that it has no content. In the same way, the distinction between poetry and prose cannot be justified, save in that of art and science. It was seen in antiquity that such distinction could not be founded on external elements, such as rhythm and metre, or on the freedom or the limitation of the form, that it was, on the contrary, altogether internal. Poetry is the language of sentiment, prose of the intellect. But since the intellect is also sentiment, in its concretion and reality, so all prose has a poetical side. The relation of first and second degree. The relation between intuitive knowledge or expression and intellectual knowledge or concept, between art and science, poetry and prose, cannot be otherwise defined than by saying that it is one of double degree. The first degree is the expression, the second the concept. The first can exist without the second, but the second cannot exist without the first. There exists poetry without prose, but not prose without poetry. Expression, indeed, is the first affirmation of human activity. Poetry is the maternal language of the human race. The first men were by nature sublime poets. We also admit this in another way, when we observe that the passage from soul to mind, from animal to human activity, is effected by means of language. And this should be said of intuition or expression in general. But to us it appears somewhat inaccurate to define language or expression as an intermediate link between nature and humanity, as though it were a mixture of the one and of the other. Where humanity appears, the rest has already disappeared. The man who expresses himself certainly emerges from the state of nature, but he really does emerge. He does not stand half within and half without, as the use of the phrase intermediate link would imply. Inexistence of other forms of knowledge. The cognitive intellect has no form other than these two. Expression and concept exhaust it completely. The whole speculative life of man is spent in passing from one to the other and back again. History, its identity with and difference from art. Historicity is incorrectly held to be a third theoretical form. History is not form but content. As form it is nothing but intuition or aesthetic fact. History does not seek for laws nor form concepts. It employs neither induction nor deduction. It is directed ad narrandum, non ad demonstrandum. It does not construct universals and abstractions, but posits intuitions. The this, the that, the individuum omni modo determinatum is its kingdom, as it is the kingdom of art. History, therefore, is included under the universal concept of art. Faced with this proposition and with the impossibility of conceiving a third mode of knowledge, objections have been brought forward, which would lead to the affiliation of history to intellective or scientific knowledge. The greater portion of these objections is dominated by the prejudice that in refusing to history the character of conceptual science, something of its value and dignity has been taken from it. This really arises from a false idea of art, conceived not as an essential theoretic function, but as an amusement, a superfluity, a frivolity. Without reopening a long debate, which so far as we are concerned is finally closed, we will mention here one sophism which has been and still is widely repeated. It is intended to show the logical and scientific nature of history. The sophism consists in admitting that historical knowledge has for its object the individual, but not the representation, it is added, so much as the concept of the individual. From this it is argued that history is also a logical or scientific form of knowledge. History, in fact, should elaborate the concept of a personage, such as Charlemagne or Napoleon, of an epoch like the Renaissance or the Reformation, of an event such as the French Revolution and the unification of Italy. This it is held to do in the same way as geometry elaborates the concepts of spatial form, or aesthetic those of expression. But all this is untrue. History cannot do otherwise than represent Napoleon and Charlemagne, the Renaissance and the Reformation, the French Revolution and the unification of Italy, as individual facts, with their individual physiognomy. That is, in the same way as logicians state that one cannot have a concept of an individual, but only a representation. The so-called concept of the individual is always a universal or general concept, full of details, very rich, if you will, but however rich it be, yet incapable of attaining to that individuality to which historical knowledge, as aesthetic knowledge, alone attains. Let us rather show how the content of history comes to be distinguished from that of art. The distinction is secondary. Its origin will be found in what has already been observed as to the ideal character of the intuition or first perception, in which all is real and therefore nothing is real. The mind forms the concepts of external and internal at a later stage, as it does those of what has happened and what is desired, of object and subject, and the like. Thus it distinguishes historical from non-historical intuition, the real from the unreal, real fancy from pure fancy. Even internal facts, what is desired and imagined, castles in the air, and countries of cocaine, have their reality. The soul, too, has its history. His illusions form part of the biography of every individual. But the history of an individual soul is history, because in it is always active the distinction between the real and the unreal, even when the real is the illusion themselves. But these distinctive concepts do not appear in history, as do scientific concepts, but rather, like those that we have seen dissolved and melted in the aesthetic intuitions, although they stand out in history in an altogether new relief. History does not construct the concepts of the real and the unreal, but makes use of them. History, in fact, is not the theory of history. Mere conceptual analysis is of no use in realizing whether an event in our lives were real or imaginary. It is necessary to reproduce the intuitions in the mind in the most complete form, as they were at the moment of production, in order to recognize the content. Historicity is distinguished in the concrete from pure imagination only as one intuition is distinguished from another, in the memory. Historical criticism, historical skepticism. Where this is not possible, owing to the delicate and fleeting shades between the real and unreal intuitions, which confuse the one with the other, we must either renounce, for the time at least, the knowledge of what really happened, and this we often do, or we must fall back upon conjecture, verisimilitude, probability. The principle of verisimilitude and of probability dominates, in fact, all historical criticism. Examination of the sources and of authority is directed toward establishing the most credible evidence. And what is the most credible evidence, save that of the best observers, that is, of those who best remember, and, be it understood, have not desired to falsify, nor had interest in falsifying the truth of things. From this it follows that intellectual skepticism finds it easy to deny the certainty of any history, for the certainty of history is never that of science. Historical certainty is composed of memory and of authority, not of analyses and of demonstration. To speak of historical induction or demonstration is to make a metaphorical use of these expressions, which bear quite a different meaning in history to that which they bear in science. The conviction of the historian is the undemonstrable conviction of the juryman, who has heard the witnesses, listened attentively to the case, and prayed heaven to inspire him. Sometimes, without doubt, he is mistaken, but the mistakes are in a negligible minority compared with the occasions when he gets hold of the truth. That is why good sense is right against the intellectualists in believing in history, which is not a fable agreed upon, but that which the individual and humanity remember of their past. We strive to enlarge and to render as precise as possible this record, which in some places is dim, in others very clear. We cannot do without it, such as it is, and taken as a whole, it is rich in truth. In a spirit of paradox only can one doubt if there ever were a Greece or a Rome, an Alexander or a Caesar, a feudal Europe overthrown by a series of revolutions, that on the 1st of November, 1517, the theses of Luther were seen fixed to the door of the church of Wittenberg, or that the Bastille was taken by the people of Paris on the 14th of July in 1789. "What proof givest thou of all this?" ask the sophists ironically. Humanity replies, "I remember." Philosophy as perfect science, the so-called natural sciences and their limits. The world of what has happened, of the concrete, of history, is the world that is called real, natural, including in this definition the reality that is called physical, as well as that which is called spiritual and human. All this world is intuition. Historical intuition, if it be realistically shown as it is, or imaginary intuition, artistic in the strict sense, if shown under the aspect of the possible, that is to say, of the imaginable. Science, true science, which is not intuition but concept, not individuality but universality, cannot be anything but a science of the spirit, that is, of what is universal in reality, philosophy. If natural sciences be spoken of, apart from philosophy, it is necessary to observe that these are not perfect sciences. They are complexes of knowledge, arbitrarily abstracted and fixed. The so-called natural sciences themselves recognize, in fact, that they are surrounded by limitations. These limitations are nothing more than historical and intuitive data. They calculate, measure, establish equalities, regularity, create classes and types, formulate laws, show in their own way how one fact arises out of other facts. But in their progress, they are always met with facts which are known intuitively and historically. Even geometry now states that it rests altogether on hypotheses, since space is not three-dimensional or Euclidean, but this assumption is made use of by preference, because it is more convenient. What there is of truth in the natural sciences is either philosophy or historical fact. What they contain proper to themselves is abstract and arbitrary. When the natural sciences wish to form themselves into perfect sciences, they must issue from their circle and enter the philosophical circle. This they do when they posit concepts which are anything but natural, such as those of the atom without extension in space, of ether or vibrating matter, of vital force, of space beyond the reach of intuition, and the like. These are true and proper philosophical efforts, when they are not mere words void of meaning. The concepts of natural science are, without doubt, most useful, but one cannot obtain from them that system which belongs only to the spirit. These historical and intuitive assumptions, which cannot be separated from the natural sciences, furthermore explain not only how, in the progress of knowledge, that which was once considered to be truth descends gradually to the grade of mythological beliefs and imaginary illusions, but also how, among natural scientists, there are some who term all that serves as basis of argument in their teaching mythical facts, verbal expedients, or conventions. The naturalists and mathematicians who approach the study of the energies of the spirit without preparation are apt to carry thither these mental habits and to speak in philosophy of such and such conventions as arranged by man. They make conventions of truth and morality, and their supreme convention is the spirit itself. However, if there are to be conventions, something must exist about which there is no convention to be made, but which is itself the agent of the convention. This is the spiritual activity of man. The limitation of the natural sciences postulates the limitation of philosophy. The phenomenon and the noumenon. These explications have firmly established that the pure or fundamental forms of knowledge are two: the intuition and the concept, art and science or philosophy. With these are to be included history, which is, as it were, the product of intuition placed in contact with the concept, that is, of art receiving in itself philosophic distinctions while remaining concrete and individual. All the other forms, natural sciences and mathematics, are impure, being mingled with extraneous elements of practical origin. The intuition gives the world, the phenomenon. The concept gives the noumenon, the spirit. End of chapter 3. Recording by Lisa Reichert.